Welcome everyone to this revision lecture for the Politics of Public Policy. The outline of this recorded lecture is really to recap on the main module themes, to kind of take stock of where we are in the module, think about the main themes that have ran through the module, but also to think about exam preparation as well. This podcast will be shorter than usual lectures because we're just bringing everything together with the module. There's no particularly new input, as it were, apart from exam preparation, but really what we're trying to do in this section of the podcast is to think about the main module themes that might help structure how you might get into some of the reading as part of your exam preparation. Okay. I think one of the things we really need to do is take stock on some of the kind of key points, the key themes that run through the module. And I think one of the first key themes we looked at the beginning of the trimester, if you can remember that far back, was what is public policy and what's political about it. We talked about the fact that public policy has many different labels, not always easy to define. You will not find authors agreeing on the specifics of a definition of public policy, but what you will find is that there's lots of authors that have views on what public policy is associated with. And the kind of common theme throughout those things is the issue of decision. Decision making is something that features heavily in public policy. How decisions are made, how they're executed, how they're evaluated, who features as part of the decision making process, which actors influence the decision making process is always state actors like bureaucrats, politicians, political institutions, or what about non-state actors like pressure groups, the media, and so on, corporations. So really what we're thinking about in the politics of public policy is the relationships between actors in affecting the decision-making process. How these actors come together, work together to influence the decision-making process, and how that is different and how that plays out in different areas of public policy. So it might be that foreign policy might have a different set of political actors that surround it than, say, health policy or, say, transport policy. So a number of different contexts, and context is very, very important in public policy. I think you're all probably aware of that by now. But the key theme here is decision making. There are lots of different policy types, undoubtedly, and really what we're trying to do is unpack the patterns of decision making. Why things happen, why are decisions made, who made them, for what reason, what was the evidence that underpinned the decision, was any evidence used? So it's thinking about all these different scenarios, controversies, theories, themes and so on. But essentially what we're trying to do in thinking about theory is to help us understand policy. We need a conceptual approach, we need theory. And the reason for that is because public policy is complex. Like I said earlier, relationships are very important in studying the politics of public policy. The relationships between political actors, okay? Be they non-state or state actors, okay? So essentially what we're trying to do here is adopt theory and concept to allow us to control for this complexity, allow us to understand this complexity, okay? So public policy really is something that we have to try and get a grasp of, and theory allows us to do this, okay? The politics of it is clear, because when you have decisions, when decisions are made by political actors, really what we've got there is a power relationship. They have the power to do something, the power to decide or to not decide. You remember earlier in the module we talked about non-decision making. The power to withhold a decision and to not decide on something is just as powerful as making a decision, because it has consequences and it affects people. But the politics of it is, well, to what extent should the decision maker have power? How democratic is this actor? How do we get rid of this actor if we're unhappy with them? What are the checks and balances? Okay, so politics, power are very, very important to understanding public policy. Okay, understanding policy and policy dynamics is a key aspect of what we try and do in public policy. Earlier in the module we talked about this idea of subsystems, which is a clever way to think about context. Every policy area has a range of different contexts and influencers that has an impact on what happens with that policy area. Most policy areas will have an international dimension to it, or even a national dimension, or even going further, a local dimension. Because, for example, it could be that, say, you're talking about defence policy. There's lots going on just now about defence policy given recent events in the world. And what we find is that defence isn't something that can just be thought about at a national level. There are international drivers for this as well. You've got NATO, the United Nations, you've got relationships with other countries. So how can we actually forget about these actors? Well, we don't, because we have relationships to them. But the area of defence will have its own subsystem, if you like. It'll have its own communities, its own networks that surround the policy area that might look a little bit different to something like animal health security. I talked about that earlier in the module, and if you go back to the lecture on that early in the module, there's a visual representation of a policy subsystem for animal health security, and that gives you a kind of, a bit of direction. It gives you a bit of an idea of what we're talking about here. But essentially what we're doing is understanding the contexts and networks and drivers that influence any area of public policy, because we have to acknowledge from the outset that there's always a dynamic there. There's always a context. Okay? There's so many different ways of approaching the study of public policy. There are theoretical frameworks that can be applied at each step in the policy process. So policy formulation might have a set of theoretical ideas associated with them. Policy decision making, there's often theories about that as well. So we're not short of theory and concept in public policy, but they all have their own features, insights, their limitations and advantages. And as we're thinking about the exam, that's something we need to kind of bear in mind is, when we come to understand policy making as a whole and models of policy making, what are the pros and cons? What are the advantages and disadvantages to these? Okay? The key point being that public policy is dynamic. It's very rarely unidirectional. It is characterised by fluidity, dynamic relationships, and it's important to be aware of that and reflect on that. One of the things that we looked at when we were studying the organisation of public policy is issues to do with public administration and management. You'll remember Professor Piper delivered a lecture on this. And essentially what we're trying to do is understand how it works. Understand how the state is administered. What are the machinery dynamics of government? How is it administered and managed? Okay, so that's something that Professor Piper focused on in the lecture. And essentially what we were thinking about was the idea of who's involved in the management of the state, i.e. which policy actors are involved. Are they, for example, central actors, government actors? Are they devolved? Do they exist at a supranational level, which basically means above the level of the nation state? What about the role of non-governmental organisations? What about other states? We used this example of defence before. Again, we can apply this here. But it's thinking about who manages the process, who has the funding to make decisions over the allocation of resources. Okay, so really what we're thinking about here is the process of policy creation and delivery and implementation from an organisational standpoint. Now, One of the themes that Professor Piper talked about was this idea of whether there's been a modular or paradigmatic shift from how we can understand the organisation of the state, moving from traditional models of public administration, very much associated with hierarchy, top-down control, clear lines of accountability and seniority, moving to a situation whereby actually with the advent of Thatcherism and Thatcherite ideas associated with the role of the private sector, whether actually the state has become more influenced by private sector ideas. In other words, they want to implement a greater level of competitiveness in the state, which basically means that we move our management practice to think more about performance management, think more about efficiency, think more about effectiveness, thinking more about benchmarking what public sector organisations do. Okay, so really the advent of Thatcherism is what gave that the real impetus, the real driver in terms of changing the model from traditional public administration to new public management. But after that, there was ideas about, well, what about this new idea of public management? Is it still there? What about governance? Is governance the new paradigm? Have we moved from traditional public administration to new public management, and now latterly to governance? Governance being thinking about the state as just one actor amongst many others, and that the state becomes more of an enabler, more of a facilitator of a range of different actors that cross-cut the private sector, the voluntary sector, and the wider public sector. Okay? But one of the things that Professor Piper tried to tell you was, let's not oversimplify this transition from new public management to governance, or traditional public administration to new public management, because essentially there are still elements of each model that exist within each of them. So is it more of a spectrum of change across these models, or are they discrete and different? Professor Piper tried to give the impression in his lecture, quite rightly, that there's dangers of oversimplifying this and overgeneralising the fact that, say, the command and control structure that was associated with traditional public administration is somehow no longer there. Well, that would be inaccurate to say that entirely, because it's still there to a degree. But at the same time, there are elements of governance now whereby the state has to engage with a broad set of actors. So is it one or the other? Or are we seeing a myriad or connection between these different models and how we can understand the organisation of the public sector? That's something to think about. We also talked about the institutional dimension. And when we're talking about the institutional dimension, really what we're talking about is the role of political institutions and how they feature in public policy making. We know that political institutions often give legitimacy to policy in the respect that legislators, say for example the Westminster Parliament, might provide legislation which allows decision makers to do certain things. So it could be that a new bill to limit the power of the police, for example, might actually have implications for, say, how the police actually conduct their business on a day-to-day basis. But because the institution itself is so-called democratic, that provides legitimacy to policymakers in many respects, because they can say that this legislation has went through a democratic process, therefore it's been legitimised by this political institution in many respects. So institutions set the policy-making rules of the game, in the sense that they present the rules, they provide the framework. It could be through legislation, it could be through norms, it could be through guidance, that affect behaviour, that affect what policymakers can and cannot do, They can keep checks and balances on what policymakers can and cannot do. If we think about the legislature in the Scottish Parliament, for example, just like the Westminster, we have a strong committee system in our legislative institutions. And basically what our select committees are there to do is to hold decision makers to account, get them to defend what they've done with public resources. Hold them to account, conduct investigations. We know that from the UK level, the Home Office Select Committee has been very involved in issues to do with immigration, issues to do with the Passport Agency, migration, all these different issues. The Home Office Select Committee has taken quite a powerful role in that. There's other committees as well. Say, for example, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee or the Treasury Select Committee that can set the rules of the game. Okay? But for the policy actor, if you're a policy maker, one of the key aspects of your role is to know how to negotiate and manage these institutions. Where do you feature as part of this institution? How can you make change happen within this institution? How do you navigate around the power dynamics that exist within this organisation? So policymakers have to think quite carefully about that. Okay. Institutions set the culture, set the norms, the rules of what can and cannot be done. In a constitutional sense, and a wider public sector sense, institutions themselves can be part of a policy-making network. A range of different institutions, agencies, organisations are important for public policy, and the nature of the organisations will differ across whatever policy area you may think about. Okay, a bit like the policy subsystem. The institutions themselves might be different depending on the policy area and the organisations. But when we're thinking about the key political institutions, we're really thinking about the role of the executive, i.e. the government, decision makers, the wider executive in terms of wider government departments. We're thinking about the role of the legislator. We're thinking about the role of the judiciary and the courts, who provide judicial review and can have an impact on policy making, because the results of a judicial review or a judicial process can set precedents for what policymakers can and cannot do. Okay? So these actors are very important, and they often exist in a multi-level setting. So we know from our own system that we have a legislature and an executive at the Scottish level, we have it at the Westminster level, but we also have it at the European level as well. And these institutions have to work together. Okay? And there needs to be inter-institutional arrangements that allow these organisations to work together. And quite often that can be set down in legislation, or it could be through concordats, understandings, agreements, and so on. An aspect of what we looked at when we looked at the policy cycle was issues to do with setting the policy agenda. So there's a range of ways to understand agenda setting and policy formulation. Now's not the place for me to go over every one of these, because information is provided in the reading and in earlier lectures on this, but it's just important to recognise the issue that this stage of the policy process has different conceptual dimensions associated with it. So, is it about the punctuated equilibrium model, whereby the best opportunity to influence the agenda might be when there's a punctuation in the status quo, whereby there's, say, for example, a crisis that allows us to kind of think about how we reorientate what we do. It might be just out of necessity, because we cannot continue with the equilibrium. We cannot continue with the status quo for a number of political, policy and technical reasons. So are there key windows of opportunity for us to think about how actors can best influence the policy process? It might be, if we think more broadly than, say, the punctuated equilibrium model, that it might be that the best time to make a change is when there's the public acceptability for something to happen. the attention of the public is at a critical point whereby change needs to happen, and that's a good time to set the policy agenda? Or is it that policy networks are working together, chipping away at government decision makers, trying to lobby and influence what's happening at the higher echelons of government, and they're trying to find ways of navigating these institutions to think about how best to pool their expertise, pool the resources together to best influence change? Or is it, for example, with multiple streams theory, when you think about the role of, say, the media coming together alongside an opportune political moment to best influence policy? Are there certain things coming together at once? Is the public mood there? Is the attention of the media there? Do you have the policymakers' acceptability for change to happen? Okay. So there's a number of ways to think about setting the policy agenda. A consistent theme, however, is power. How powerful are policy networks to influence change? Who are the powerful actors when it comes to influencing change after the equilibrium has been punctured by, say, a crisis and so on? Okay, so thinking about power dynamics is extremely important. Okay, so each do have their advantages and drawbacks, but it's important to consider the different actors involved in the policy formulation process, how the agenda is set in the first place, and what are the implications of that for the rest of the policy process. Decision making and implementation. Now, like before, there are different interpretations of the decision making process. There's different models attached to these, and again, you have details on those from your wider reading and from the lecture content earlier in the module. One of the themes we did pick up on quite a lot in the module was the idea of the relationship between evidence and public policy, and whether there's a consistent relationship or a clear relationship between evidence and policy. To what extent should evidence feature in public policy? Is it the case that the evidence is perhaps unclear? Has the evidence been developed in a politically motivated way? Can we suggest that the concept of evidence is value free? How's evidence gathered? What are the best ways to get evidence into policy? And that's something that we tried to talk about earlier in the module, but when we had the guest input as well from Gareth Reid from NHS Health Scotland, we reflected on some of the politics of getting evidence into policy and some of the challenges with that. So that's an important debate. The political system itself can influence the decision-making process. The nature of how decisions are made can influence whether decision-making is particularly quick or slow, whether it's been subject to much scrutiny, whether those decision-makers are held to account. Okay, and that can depend on, say, the operation of the legislator. It could depend on the way that the executive operates. It might be that the executive obviously consists of a cabinet of all the senior ministers of the government. It might be that decision making happens very quickly. The advent of Blairism post 1997 has given us the kind of view of the cabinet being less about deliberation and discussion, but more about making quick decisions. Whereas in decades before that, even in Thatcher's government and even before that, the idea often was that the cabinet would sit and deliberate for days at a time sometimes, discuss where policy should go, discuss the decision-making process. The operation of the executive and the management of that can have an impact on the decision-making process. Now that's just one example. Okay, so there's lots of institutional and political and systemic, I should say, influences that have implications for the decision-making process. You also understand that following decision-making and the cycle framework, implementation is an important step that involves a range of governmental and non-governmental actors. We talked about the different interpretations of that. Is policy implemented very much a kind of top-down command and control type way, or is it more bottom-up? What about the role of those at the bottom, what we call street-level bureaucrats, in actually marshalling and influencing the implementation process to suit their own ends? Do they translate policy in the exact way that policymakers have set out the policy to be implemented? But sometimes it's a little bit more of a grey area between the two models, because quite often what government will do is set public sector organisations, or say local government or local partnerships, a kind of broad set of policy direction, if you like. It might say to local organisations, by 2020 I want to see health inequalities reduced by, say, 20% in this area. Now, it's not, the government aren't saying what you need to do exactly to get that figure. So they might give you some autonomy and some freedom to do that. But it's giving you the broad set of aims and goals that you need to work to. So it's quite top down in a sense, because these directions and these aims and objectives are coming from a higher level, coming from a decision maker. But those agencies and actors on the ground might have autonomy and freedom given to them by those in authority, if you like, to translate the policy in a way that might suit their own local contexts. And that context might be dependent upon the geographical situation, the financial situation. It could be to do with the local demographic and the nature of local populations. It might not be correct or sensible to implement a policy in the islands and the Highlands and Islands in the same way as central Glasgow, because of the nature of the different local contexts. So we need to think about the different dynamics there. It's also important to remember that implementation isn't something that's always easily done, because you're dealing with people, you're dealing with organisations which often have agendas, and therefore that can breed issues like coordination and conflict dynamics, which can have an impact on the implementation of public policy. At its worst, conflict can inhibit change, inhibit the ability of policy to be implemented. It might not make it a very swift and efficient process, because actors are arguing amongst themselves, trying to lobby for resources, and it might become quite difficult. But if you look at it from a different point of view, Paul Sabatier, when he talks about the advocacy coalition framework, one of the things that he talks about is the fact that conflict in itself is not bad. Conflict and a reasonable level of it, and a manageable level of it, can be good, because what happens is that you're able to have a constructive discussion on the best ways to do things. If there wasn't that discussion, or that a level of conflict that allows you to reflect and think about best practice, then that would be a bad thing, according to Sabatier. However, getting the balance right is something that policymakers really have to think about. Interorganisational coordination as well is a difficult matter, in the sense that you might have a policy area that cross-cuts two different areas of policy. You might have issues to do with security in the country. Bioterrorism could be an issue that the government is interested in, and that might actually cross-cut public health, and it might cross-cut animal health areas as well. So basically what you've got there is a dynamic between two government departments that might be responsible for animal health and one responsible for public health. So how do they two work together? Will they always be singing off the same hymn sheet? Could it be that within the same department that there's factions and different agendas that feature? Go back to the lecture on that when I give the example of the role of the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs after the foot and mouth crisis in 2001, thinking about the institutional dynamics within the organisation, which wasn't always helpful. and it didn't always make for an effective process of policy making. And I think all of this, a good way to wrap up the implementation dimension here, is to think about Hogwood and Gunn's perspectives on whether actually perfect implementation is something that's attainable in the real world of policy making. They argue that perfect implementation isn't possible for a number of reasons, and that can include things like those on the ground not interpreting policy decisions in the way that policy decision makers intended. It might be due to staff and resource limitations that don't allow you to implement in the best possible way. It might be that policy has to go through a number of different actors before it reaches you, because it might be a partnership-based approach to implementation, and ideas and work streams might be unclear between actors. Things can fall between two partners. Again, there's a number of different aspects to this, so this will be helpful for you to reflect on some of those themes as you do more reading around this. As I said before, evidence is quite an important aspect of the module and the relationship between evidence and policy. And we spent a bit of time looking at this, and we looked at the nature of research, evaluation. We talked about the role of expertise, the technocratic inputs to the policy process. We talked about the politics of expertise, such as the role of epistemic communities, technocratic actors. Now, we're talking about technocratic actors. What we're talking about there is those that have a policy-making role that come from a professional or expert-based background. We have lots of civil servants and policymakers that come from a more generalist background and don't actually have expertise in a particular area, but we do have policymakers that might be, for example, they could be vets by trade, they could be scientists, so we'll get scientific technocrats who are currently involved in discussions around climate change and how to get carbon emissions down. A lot of that's going on just now at the Paris Summit on climate change. So we have lots of actors that have different identities. They might be a policymaker, but they're also part of a professional community, an epistemic community. And we thought about how these actors come together to influence the policy process at a number of different levels. When we're thinking about different levels, what we tried to think about was this idea of multi-level governance. Now, Margaret Arnott talked about the idea of multi-level governance as part of her lecture. And what she tried to do was continue the theme of what we've been talking about thus far in terms of a dynamic in public policy, to think about the dispersal of power across a number of tiers of government. Okay? One of the things that's important to remember is when we're talking about the dispersal of power, we're not just talking about a kind of vertical relationship, a kind of multi-level perspective. So, for example, we're not just talking about, say, the relationship between the Scottish government upwards to the UK government, then upwards to the EU, and the dynamic between those levels. We're actually talking about a horizontal dimension as well. It could be to do with how different local authorities work together, or how local authorities work with NHS bodies, and so on. Okay, at the same level. So essentially what we're doing is thinking about the range of governmental and non-governmental actors that come together across dimensions. It could be geographical dimensions, okay? Up the way and across the way, yeah? So the idea here is when we're thinking about governance, and remember when Bobby Piper was talking about governance, he was talking about the range of actors that are involved in the policy process, and the fact that the state is just but one actor. Well, essentially what multi-level governance dimensions try to do is to think a bit more about those blurred boundaries between state and non-state actors. Okay, the public and private sector perspectives on decision making is important here, in the sense that those actors that represent the private or the public might be involved in decision making. The useful thing about multi-level governance and territorial dimensions is that it helps us think about some of the more formal and informal relationships that have an impact on decision making. To what extent is decision making something that happens in the corridor, out with the view of the masses? If we think about something like the European Union, the European Union is inherently, given the locality and the nature of it, it can be quite difficult for the public to know on a day-to-day basis how decisions are being made and keep a hold on that, because decision making takes place on a number of levels every day in the EU across a number of policy areas. So how do we keep stock of that? How do we keep our policymakers held to account for those things? Very, very difficult. But the nature of the beast is that by virtue of being in a multi-level system, decisions might often be made in quite a ad hoc way, might not always go through the parliamentary channels, depending on the nature of the issue. We talked before about the role of secondary legislation, statutory instruments that can happen very quickly, that aren't subject to much in the way of scrutiny. It might be that a legislative act gives the government, by virtue of the legislation, power to take quite a flexible approach. So if we think about in Scotland, in the past few months, the Community Empowerment Bill in Scotland has been ratified by the Scottish Parliament, and the Community Empowerment Bill tries to get community organisations and local government to think about how to actually work together as part of a community planning partnership, as part of a network to best deliver local services. Okay? Now, what that requires is a territorial approach, because you've got different actors coming together in a horizontal way in this example to think about how they can best address what the government want them to do in terms of addressing national outcomes to do with, could be health and well-being, could be about sustainability, environmental change, but these actors have to come together as a result of this legislation to be empowered, because the bill's called the Community Empowerment Bill. It's trying to empower decision making at a local level, or get local decision making to take place at local level, and to empower actors to do that. But how do we kind of deal with the kind of blurred lines between these actors? Who's taking responsibility for what? Who's being held to account for what as part of the Community Empowerment Bill? So these are interesting debates that will go on, particularly in that example, over the next few years. But the key point to take from that is that there can be blurred lines between actors. And what does that mean for lines of accountability, lines of responsibility, who's taking responsibility for what, when and where? And also, what about the emergence of issues to do with culpability avoidance and blame gaming? If lines of accountability are blurred and it's not clear who's responsible for what within a partnership governance type context, does that mean it's easy to blame other actors when things go wrong because it's unclear about who's taking responsibility for what? Remember, this is the politics of public policy, so these are the issues that we need to think about. We need to think about the politics, we need to think about blame gaming, we need to think about the policy dynamic, who's responsible, accountability, responsibility, all those different things, and how that plays out. Another debate that comes up in the issues to do with multi-level and territorial dimensions is the idea of national decision makers and how they exist within a European framework. So to what extent has British policy making been subject to the process of Europeanisation? Is British policy making anymore? Is that possible because we work in a multi-level context? Okay. So is it the case that because we're part of the European Union that our policy making has been Europeanised to an extent? Well, it'd be quite difficult to argue that the European Union doesn't have a role in many areas of public policy. If we think about agricultural policy, British agricultural policy is inherently European because it sits within a European legislative framework. Okay, but what that means for policymakers is policymakers at the national level, say at the UK level or even the Scottish level, have to think about best working with their European counterparts within the institutions of the EU, because what they'll be looking to do from the point of view of national policymakers is to influence the terms of the debate, to influence what happens at the European Union level to best fit with the agenda that they have. So it's a tool in the box of what policymakers need to do, in the sense that policymakers have to have the attributes to be able to work with these multi-level actors and secure what they want from them. Okay? This idea of Europeanisation has become more of a concept in politics. And basically what Europeanisation helps us to do is to think about whether we are being influenced by Europe or whether we are influencing Europe. Okay? Or is it both? It could be that there's what we call an uploading and downloading idea, whereby we're uploading our policy preferences to the EU to try and get the best wins we can, to secure our best interests, but then also we have to implement at the same time. So it's more of a dynamic, a kind of cyclical dynamic, uploading and downloading, and it goes round and round. But how we actually navigate that process is a key task for policymakers, and it's a challenge. Okay? There's also the dynamic of devolution as well. We all know from the recent developments in Scotland that post referendum on independence that there are further processes being discussed about how the UK impacts on Scottish affairs and how Scottish affairs impact on policy process at the UK level. We all know about the recent issues to do with the Scotland Bill and how more powers will be coming to the Scottish Parliament. But concurrently, there's issues to do with whether Scottish members of Parliament should vote on English issues if the legislation decides at the UK level only affects England. Whereas before, Scottish policymakers could have a say over that because they're part of a United Kingdom Parliament. So there's questions there about how has devolution affected the politics of the policy process. So that's something for you to think about as well. The final substantive input from Professor Margaret Arnott was to look at the issues to do with comparative public policy and global governance issues. Now, as part of this process, really what we're thinking about doing is thinking about policy making above the level of the nation state. Thinking about how we can understand the process of how policy making has cross-national implications. How policy making has an international dimension to it. What is it that policymakers really want to do here in the global context? Do they want to learn from the experience of other countries? Do they want to actually have the best evidence from other countries in order to implement it in their own context? So if, for example, in China they've taken a certain approach to how they manage their railway system, is that something the government over here will look at when trying to develop evidence for politicians about the best way to address issues to do with railway infrastructure and development? When is it appropriate for governments to learn from each other? Is it a rational process? Is it the case that you would take one model, say adopted in China, and develop it as is, like as it is over there, for our own context? Is that always appropriate, or would we tweak it for our own conditions? Okay. The literature talks about the ideas of policy learning and transfer. Now, these are very, very important themes to think about when we're thinking about comparative public policy, because these are the concepts that allow us to hold our thinking together on policy transfer and learning. Why do policymakers learn from other countries? Why should we converge our policy making practices to be like those in other countries? Is it possible to transfer policy from one context or the other? Is it desirable? What's the politics of that? So it's these themes that we need to think about. Are there external and internal pressures for doing so? Is it the case that as part of an international global community that it would be quite odd for policymakers not to look at their counterparts overseas and think about how the best way to develop policy and implement policy? Okay. So experiences, knowledge, how governments learn from each other, very, very important. Okay. Transferring knowledge or policy, should it be done? How do we do it? Who transfers knowledge? Is it epistemic communities? Is it policy networks? Okay. So it's these different questions that you need to think about. So those are the kind of main themes that we've talked about in the module. Now, throughout the different dimensions of what we've looked at in the module, we've also looked at issues to do with evaluation. We've looked at issues to do with formulation. We've actually looked at issues to do with policy termination as well. To what extent do policies terminate entirely? To what extent is it easy to evaluate policy? Again, these are things that we've been reflecting on in the module. But I think one of the things to think about when you're looking at any of these debates, really, is about the consistent theme of power and how that plays out as part of any of this. Okay? The next step in the recorded lecture is to think about exam preparation. For the exam itself, there'll be 2 essay questions to tackle out of a possible 6 options. You'll be unsurprised for me when it comes to me saying that you need to read, and read again, because that is how you embed the learning from the lectures. It'll also allow you to expand your breadth of knowledge of the module, which often can shine through in examination answers. Now, lectures can only do so much. Seminars can only do so much. The onus is on students as we make this transition for you to become more independent learners to do more reading. Reading will not be something that will damage you in any way. In fact, it's really the thing that you can do that will best allow you to get a broad and a depth of knowledge around the module. Okay? Essentially what you're trying to do with your exam answer is, although you're addressing the question directly that you're answering, you're able to kind of draw in a number of different aspects of the module into your answer, because with the politics of public policy, it's not easy to draw a line between different themes. So, for example, if we're talking about implementation, it's quite difficult to not mention decision making, because they are both related to each other at some level. So that's okay. It's okay to reflect on those things in your answers. But I would suggest that if you're able to engage with some sources in your answer, then that is useful. It might be that you don't remember quotes, and that's okay. You don't need to write verbatim quotes. But if you're able to say, well, this author's perspective on this issue is this, or this author suggests this, then this can actually help the analytical rigour of your answer. And it demonstrates, and this is important, it demonstrates your awareness of the reading, and it demonstrates your engagement with the reading as well. Okay? But don't forget the basics. It's very, very important to have a clear introduction, main body, and conclusion. Don't get so anxious and stressed that you forget to actually take this logical approach to your answer. Okay? Think before you answer the question. Okay? Don't rush it. Think about it. Do it in a coherent way so that you feel settled and so that your points come across clearly, and also it's clear how you're answering the question. Okay? Provide examples for your main arguments to demonstrate an understanding. Examples are very important. Mentioning some sources is advisable, allowing you to demonstrate an understanding. Okay? Okay, right, here's what you've all been waiting for. Top tips, handy hints on potential themes that might come up in the exam that can allow you to kind of best think about how you might want to prepare for the exam, and allow you to think about how you can get into the reading around the examination. As we've discussed throughout the module and in this recorded lecture, we've considered models of policy making, and these have included some of the kind of more general models of the policy making process, and this included the rational model and the incremental model, and there were some others as well. Okay, but we looked at the rational model and we looked at the incremental model, and One of the things you might want to reflect on as part of your reading is to think about what these mean, these kind of key models. Okay, so I've mentioned the rational model and the incremental model. Okay, so these are the key ones we're talking about at the moment. And what do they mean, and how useful are they? And how do we know? What examples can we draw on from that? Okay. We also considered the stages of the policy process and whether any one stage is more important than the other, or whether they are just as important as each other. Okay. So it's important to understand what each stage of the policy process represents and examples of each of these stages. We also talked about the limitations of the cycle framework in terms of how policy making is quite complex and it's not always easy to put it into nice stages. What's the reasons for that? Okay. We also considered issues to do with policy instrumentation, policy instruments, and the possible types that can be used by policymakers. You might want to have a wee think about the different policy instruments, different types, and the different examples of policy types. We also considered the concept of learning in comparative public policy and the extent to which this is important and why. To what extent is it important? What are the challenges surrounding it? We also considered perspectives on governance. You remember from earlier in the recorded lecture and from Professor Piper's lecture that we considered perspectives on governance and the changes from public administration to new public management and the similarities and differences between these interpretations. So we considered whether actually there are similarities, whether there are differences, are there elements of public administration in new public management? Are there elements of similarity between new public management and governance? How do we understand that? Okay, so think about these different interpretations on the organisation of public policy. We also looked at the fact that power is a theme running through the politics of public policy. We talked about power. Now, given that the theme is very important to what we're doing in the module, and it underpins much of the content of the module, now is a good time to reflect on the importance of power in public policy. I hope you found this revision lecture useful in terms of drawing together some of the key themes of the module. Also hope you found the exam preparation advice to be useful as you get into your reading and into your exam preparation. I very much enjoyed my involvement in the module, so thank you for your engagement. On behalf of the module team, myself, Margaret Arnott and Robert Piper, we wish you all the best for the exam. Bear in mind that you can come and see me in January if you want to have a discussion about the exam, and all the best with it when it comes. Thank you.